What's happening now is a threat to academic freedom in general and to the integrity of university culture. People who may be thinking about other kinds of genocides or horrible things that are happening in the world, they should be very, very attentive to the way in which the crackdown on Palestinian activism is being used to stop critical inquiry in general. You'll often find a lot of right-wing politicians talking about cancel culture and so forth, but actually people who are being deplatformed and who are really facing serious repercussions for their activism and their courage are disproportionately activists for Palestine and Palestinian rights. The first thing that struck me as I went through the checkpoints, as I made my way between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, was just how segregated the society is and just how much Palestinians do live under apartheid. It's the lines for Palestinians are the ones where soldiers point guns at their faces. I saw Palestinians humiliated while waiting in checkpoints, having to undress while meanwhile this Israeli soldier without a face behind a dark glass yells at them. And I saw bus systems that were completely divided between Palestinians and Israelis. And my point of reference for all of what I saw was what I learned about in school and seen historically as an American, the Jim Crow era in the US. I lived right across from the wall, and so I took a lot of notes and documented everything. And I published as sort of my final farewell. I published a brief article in an online publication called Counterpunch called Beyond Antisemitism. What's really significant about this definition is that it targets criticism of Israel as the most significant kind of anti-Semitism. So there are 11 examples of what anti-Semitism is in the definition, and 7 of those are concerned with the criticism of Israel. So when I was accused of anti-Semitism, I will say that I was completely shocked. It was the furthest thing from my mind. I actually am of Jewish heritage. A student who describes himself as a Zionist anonymously published an article in the student newspaper in which he flagged my articles as an example of kind of the direction in which academia is going. But then a campaign kind of accumulated once people who were not affiliated with the university found out, and an article was published in a newspaper called the Daily Telegraph. Various politicians got involved, calling for me to be fired. No one who was offended, no one even who was defending me was actually talking about Palestine. And yet the entire debate in the UK about my basically forgotten article was about whether certain students were offended, students who were not in any way identified or interested in what was going on in Palestine. And so not an accident that within a few weeks of when this article came out about me, the University of Exeter, which is just about an hour away, a series of anti-apartheid week events were canceled for the first time in the history of Palestinian activism in the UK. Recently, a PhD student published an article that was critical of Israel. It was after it was published and after it went through peer review. It was retracted and criticized by the editors because it came under fire from an Israel advocacy group. And that is an example of unwarranted interference in academic processes. What's important to be aware of, it's not an intellectual process. It's not about defending academic freedom. It's about avoiding risk. And that's not really compatible, with critical inquiry. And that creates a culture of self-censorship because people they just don't want to, deal with it. So in the 1990s, there was a series of conferences funded by Israeli governmental ministries to develop a new definition of anti-Semitism. And the reason that was given for the need for a new definition was because it was perceived that although historically it was acknowledged that anti-Semitism was typically a right-wing problem coming from, say, fascists and nationalists, at this moment in history, the Israeli government perceived that the sharpest criticism against the practice of apartheid that was taking place in the occupied territories was coming from the left. And so they wanted a definition that targeted directly leftist manifestations of anti-Semitism. And most of those manifestations, according to the government, are to do with the criticism of Israel. It doesn't have any clear procedural value, and yet it's invoked emotionally all the time. And so it obscures, I think, a sense of due process. That makes it very complicated, to be principled and to stand up for one's beliefs, because the consequence is that people lose faith that there is a system in place to protect them. But there is a way of pushing back. And that is, insisting on the legally enshrined right of freedom of expression and demanding clarifications. I'm hopeful, actually, about over the long term that academic freedom and free speech is going to be defended and recognized as long as we don't give in to self-censorship.